Hi everyone, welcome to the 2020 Castle Lectures. As many of you know, the Castle Lectures are the signature event of the Ethics, Politics, and Economics major, and we are so fortunate to have a very distinguished speaker with us, who I will introduce in just a minute, but I want to make sure everybody knows what the Castle Lectures are, so that you will know what Justice Cuéllar is contributing to, what tradition he's contributing to. In 1988, John Castle provided money to Yale that established this lecture series to promote a concern about ethical issues, and particularly ethical issues facing public policy in society today. And he did so in honor of his ancestor, Reverend James Pierpont. How many of you know who Reverend James Pierpont is? Some of you, somewhat. He was a Harvard-trained congregational minister who founded the Collegiate School of Connecticut in 1701. How many of you know what the Collegiate School of Connecticut is? Some of you do know. It was renamed after its benefactor, Elihu Yale. And so he was one of the founders of this institution. And James Pierpont's son-in-law was Jonathan Edwards. Another descendant was James Pierpont Morgan. So we're grateful to this family for their contribution to Yale and to the Ethics, Politics, and Economics major. And so today, tomorrow, and Thursday, we are the beneficiaries of the wisdom of Justice Mariano-Florentino Cuéllar, who is one of the key spokespeople and thinkers and actors of our day around issues that come before him in the California Supreme Court. And these are issues, some of which you'll be talking about today, such as global warming, the role of money in society, immigration, and you will all have a chance to participate in the conversation. So I'm going to suggest that we allow Justice Cuéllar to have the floor. We will give students the first crack at comments and questions from the floor, and we have until 5:30 for our conversation. But let me tell you a little more about Justice Cuéllar. And this is the second time that I've had the honor to introduce him to an audience. The first time was several years ago when he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And at that time, I was very interested to learn some things that I think you will be interested to know as well. In his early teens, he was living in Mexico, and he would daily cross the border from his home in Matamoros, Mexico, to pursue a junior high school education in Brownsville, Texas. And in that daily commute, he learned a great deal about his community and about the broader world. The world, he now says, is as messy and complicated as it is beautiful and full of possibility. And I think this really does capture in some ways the generosity of spirit that he has cultivated and brought with him to our conversation today. In 1993, he earned his BA from Harvard. He then got a JD from Yale Law School. After that, he got a PhD in political science at Stanford. And then he worked in the Clinton administration. He clerked for Chief Judge Mary Schroeder of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit before accepting a position on the faculty of the Stanford Law School, where he still works, still teaches, while being a justice on the Supreme Court of the state of California. In 2014, he was nominated by then California Governor Jerry Brown to the California Supreme Court and is now the first Mexican-born judge to serve on that court, where on behalf of the people of the state, he now applies the lessons that he learned straddling political, disciplinary, and professional boundaries. And so we're so fortunate to have this very broadly educated and widely absorbing of all of the world's lessons to share with us today. So join me in
Thank you. That's very fun. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rosenbluth. I will go anywhere you want me to go to if you introduce me. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm really grateful. You know, it's such a huge honor to be back at Yale in this capacity, and I'll share a little bit about why. But I also want to tell you, my son, who was annoyed that I was taking this trip, he said, "Why are you doing this? Only 5.75 people are going to show up." Now, I don't know where he came up with a 0.75, but I will proudly tell him that he has underestimated how many people have come. So Yale and New Haven has probably had a big effect on all of you. It's had a huge effect on me. I'll tell you a little bit about why. I remember being awed when I got here by the vast breadth of knowledge and insight and people, by the incredible architecture, but also by the proximity of Yale to the city, and by the incredible contrast, by the mix of stunning beauty and architecture, but also how close it was to penury and poverty. This is only the 6th time I've been back to New Haven since I graduated from law school in 1997. In one of those times, I came back and I came across Jung Langbein, who is one of Nick Perillo's colleagues and Steve Wisner's colleagues, a remarkable man, who was a sort of legendary teacher of the common law. And I said to him, "Professor Langbein, I never had a chance to take a class with you when I was here." And he said, "Whose fault was that?" So that comes to mind too, in thinking, why haven't I been back to New Haven more? It's my fault, but I hope to change that. And I never imagined that I'd have an honor like this when I was in law school. It's brought back a flood of memories that I was just jotting down earlier today as I was thinking about how to start these talks. I remember being in a class with my torts professor, Peter Schuck, and what it felt like when he called on me the 3rd or 4th day of torts class. And it turned out to be a very easy question, but he made this big fat check mark on the chart after calling on me, and I just felt this rush of relief. I remember the thrill of being in Jerry Mashaw's administrative law class and making a comment and then hearing the professor say, "Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a very thoughtful way of putting it." And that warm glow kind of stayed with me for days afterwards. I remember the joys and frustrations of the immigration clinic as we worked on asylum cases for African and Haitian immigrants, one of whom showed up on the wrong day, or at least maybe I had the wrong day and I didn't know what to say. I remember also my younger brother, who was in high school at Wilbur Cross and living with me for a number of reasons. And it was just an unbelievable experience to be sharing my time at Yale with a kid who was in high school. There were some moments that were trying. I was at a seminar once, a health policy seminar, and we had these pagers that we would use back then. So many of you didn't live through that era, but these things called pagers. We didn't have cell phones. And so if somebody called you on the pager, it would show a number. And the code we had was that if it was a real emergency, my brother would call the pager and it would say 911. So it said 911. I left my class, went to this thing called a payphone, put a coin in it, called my brother, and he said, "Hey, what are we having for dinner?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, we have something at home." And he said, "Okay, we have peanut butter, pasta, 2 eggs, a pickle, bread, and an apple." And I could see both the possibilities and the limitations of any resulting dinner. Soon thereafter, we discovered a solution to our dinner problems, at least when we had a little money in our pockets, which was to go to Clark's Dairy, which I hope is still here. If you tell me it's not, I'll be heartbroken. I'm leaving right now. But we would go and we would order a chicken souvlaki, garlic bread, and a Greek salad, and we would just share that. And we would just eat it so hungrily that the waitress would just bring us unlimited amounts of garlic bread. And it was like one of my favorite meals. So we have like a limitless supply of memories from New Haven. I want to set up my discussion with you today by saying, just sharing something that happened shortly after I left New Haven. I went to work at the US Department of the Treasury. And I had been working at Treasury for maybe a year when I was asked to go to Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. How many of you have heard of Oak Ridge? Okay, so Oak Ridge National Laboratory is one of the laboratories in the US National Lab System. They develop technology for the use of the US government. They also play an important role in the nuclear weapons infrastructure of the country. They enrich uranium. So what was I doing at Oak Ridge National Lab, you might be asking. So in the early post-war, post-Cold War era, so we're talking the late 1990s now, the national labs were looking for new ways to purpose their technology, their infrastructure of scientists and researchers and machinery and possibilities for innovation. And they had gotten interested in potentially exploring partnerships with agencies in the US government that worked on law enforcement. They also were interested in working with the Energy Department, which they were a part of, to maybe develop new ideas about sources of energy. So there I was representing Maine Treasury with ATF agents with me. ATF was at the time a part of the Treasury, the agency that did firearms regulation and enforcement. And we were asking questions about the lab's technology, how it could affect a phenomenon that was garnering growing interest called climate change. And amidst these conversations, we were on a bus moving through the lab, the physical space of the lab, which is in this set of ridges and hills in rural Tennessee, very beautiful, and fenced off. And then the announcer on the bus says, oh, by the way, any of you who are interested, that over there is the Y12 building. That's the building where they actually do the enriching of uranium. And it made an impression on me. I thought about a family friend who had lived through the Nagasaki explosion in Japan as a child and couldn't herself had children as a result. When I got back to DC, I walked over to Kramer Books and picked up a copy of Robert Oppenheimer's Correspondence. It's incredible. I recommend it highly if you have any bandwidth at all. Oppenheimer is a very complicated man. He studied Sanskrit and physics, and his letters from his youth up to the time that he was working on nuclear weapons development are replete with reflections and a sense of the tragedy and the beauty of the world, a sense of how gorgeous New Mexico was, but also the sense of tension he felt as he could almost anticipate what the world was heading towards, and it made him feel excited and concerned in a way. So years after my visit to Oak Ridge, I got a call that felt to me like its own kind of bomb, although I'm guilty of saying it that way given the seriousness of the topic. But I was asked by a major university to give a commencement address to the students. And somehow in the weeks that followed that invitation, my trip to Oak Ridge came back to my mind. And I thought about how somehow I was so fascinated by the sense of possibility there, the scientists and how creative they were, the sense of joy they had about their work, their eagerness to find new ways to get their knowledge to be useful for the world, but also an ineluctable quality of a sense of coming up really close to the industrial production aspect of war and how painful and damaging that can be at times, as well as protective of our country. So I had this sense of trying to write a speech that would somehow give voice to that. But I found that as I got closer and closer to the date of giving that speech, there was another impulse that competed with that. And it was that other impulse, a sense of humbly being so appreciative for the life that I've had and the chance to be in this country, that ultimately won out. So I want to read you just a couple of paragraphs of what I said that day when I finally got up there and faced a whole bunch of students, and it turned out to be 102 degrees, which made me want to rush through the speech as much as I could. I don't feel that pressure today. And I said, think of the world as it stood when FDR was a baby. Back then, nearly 40% of children around the world died before age 5. Today, only 4% of children do. As my grandfather was teaching himself to read in rural Mexico a century ago, global literacy was 12%. Now it's 85% of the world's population that can read. In her northern Mexican kitchen, my grandmother worked miracles with corn, cilantro, tomato, serrano peppers, and sadly, lard. Her own grandparents could have scarcely imagined the bounty of nutrition at her fingertips. That so much food is grown by so few people is a miracle, making it possible for us to study artificial intelligence and art history. We make so much water clean enough to drink that we can literally shower in it. As we celebrate your graduation, we have the means to enjoy lives that are not only more fulfilling, but twice as long on average as when my grandfather was born. You are the heirs to this gift of progress across time and for some of us across borders. It's a testament to creativity, to science, to our ability to understand and affect how society changes over the merest instant of historical time. My father's father began life as a shepherd in rural northern Mexico and had no formal education. Leaving his parents at 12, he struggled to make it to the border city where I would eventually be born. And later, he worked to create a municipal waterworks, bringing the city clean water. He faced not only engineering problems, but the complacency and corruption that to this day can frustrate even the most laudable efforts to improve public health. Yet he succeeded in the end, and clean water helped strengthen the city's health, literally and figuratively. Let me now add that not everything I mentioned was honey and roses in that speech. Of course, I talked about economic inequality. I talked about how disconnected universities could feel from the world around them. I did my best to treat this as a point of departure for a conversation about the need for sharp awareness of the people and situations we might encounter in our lives that are just at the very edge of our awareness, and how it's important not to let them be airbrushed out of our thinking. Peripheral vision would help us see the world as filled with nuances and subtle trade-offs. And yet the larger context I sketched out was one of enormous progress, making me sound in that riff a bit like a TED Talk from Professor Steven Pinker. But I never found a way that day to work in the disconcerting reflections from my visit to Oak Ridge. That's what I want to do tonight, in the form of a partial rebuttal to at least one interpretation of my remarks in 2017. I want to convey a reminder of just how messy the world is, how imperfectly our laws, policies, and social conventions are serving us as we go about trying to make the world better. A physicist once eviscerated a paper by saying it was so bad it wasn't even wrong. We don't say that in law, but sometimes folks think that, and I hope to avoid that here. But I want to just basically share with you my perspective on why the world, being as messy as it is and as beautiful as it is full of peril and full of unresolved problems that I want to particularly highlight too, that keep me up at night, and I hope that they generate concern for you as well. I'm going to do that mostly in the first talk. In the second talk, I'll talk about a related problem, which also bedevils a lot of what I've worked on over the course of my career, which is how we go about weighing costs and benefits. When we say something is the right thing for people to do in society, the right policy, the right regulatory rule, the right judicial decision when the law gives some opportunity for the weighing of costs and benefits. Also, to some extent, how another CASA lecturer who came and talked about effective altruism, how those very concepts about weighing costs and benefits might play a role in our own lives, and why they're more complicated than they look. And in the last talk, I want to try to bring that together and apply it to a very exciting and dynamic source of human ingenuity right now, artificial intelligence, and what that might mean if we take seriously not only our own limitations, but its own limitations. So that's why I hope that you show up, some of you, not just today, but I'm glad you're here today. So let's talk for a minute about what the world looks like. Humans today are indeed heirs to a world of almost unimaginable wealth and technological capacity relative to what 2-3 generations ago experienced, though we also contend with staggering tragedy and inequality. We've achieved dominance over our planet to the extent that that you see and that you experience in your lives. We've seen extreme poverty decline substantially in just a few generations. If you go back further than a few generations, so further than 150 years, of course the picture looks more complicated. As Professor Jim Scott from Yale reminds us in one of my favorite recent books, Against the Grain, many people didn't find the early stages of modern sedentary civilization like all that fun and enjoyable. For individuals and even large populations, almost any coherent account of their well-being often showed declines or low levels of growth for centuries and even millennia, not to mention kind of existential questions about what the meaning of life is when you are not free and wild and to some extent experiencing a degree of flexibility that you don't when you have to go to work and you have to till the land and life begins to look very, very differently. All that said, the foundations that were laid over those centuries made possible extraordinary progress, and the latter stages of the Industrial Revolution have made us heirs to just incredible power and wealth. But the picture is complicated if you look more closely. And it strikes me as quite bold to presume that several centuries of progress, as against hundreds of thousands of years of humanity, are guaranteed to last and to keep this trend going much like it is. Species suffer when they can't adapt to the environment, and avoiding calamity takes effort and concern, sometimes born, frankly, from fear. So, what's more, even the recent picture is complicated. Between 1960 and 2015, global gigatons of CO2 emissions have gone from 10 to just under 40 a year. Freshwater resources per capita have declined from over 13 cubic kilometers to 6. We have less than 50% of the vertebrate species relative to what existed in 1970. Even as we recognize that hundreds of millions of people are living better lives relative to just 5 decades ago, if we're honest, we can also hear jarring sounds of distress, not just persisting, but growing. Between 1960 and 2010, the percentage of black men in America without a high school diploma that were between the ages of 25 and 29. So black men, no high school diploma, between ages 25 and 29, who were incarcerated, grew from 7% to a total of about 33% in America. The comparable percentage for white men without a diploma, same demographic, went from about 3.5% to 7%. And looming in the background, of course, the environmental consequences of the industrial economy and geopolitics, particularly with respect to not only climate change but nuclear armaments, grind on. From almost any defensible perspective, climate change and the problems associated with it demand massive and strategic action. Even 2 degrees in average temperature rise would devastate many countries, drastically degrade the environment, spur mass irregular migration, starkly heighten global wealth inequalities, and require adaptation at staggering cost. All this is so familiar that I actually struggle with how to say it in a way that doesn't make it sound more anodyne, like, all right, there goes somebody else again talking about the climate change stuff. So I play with the words, and I'm not sure I'm getting it right, but I'll just tell you, it really is striking to me in particular to focus on what the IPCC says about what we've learned are now consequences that we are seeing with just 1 degree of warming relative to the baseline scenario. So it was reasonable to assume until recently that if we just avoided anything over 2 degrees in warming, things would pretty much be fine. But 1 degree of warming is producing heat waves, heavy precipitation, drought, sea level rise, wildfires, which are all too close to home in California, agricultural disruptions in health, economic growth, and conflict. The science behind this is complex, and I've looked at it, and I know, and you know, that isolating causal effects is really, really tough. But it's getting better and better and more accurate, and I would just say the burden of proof is really on somebody who wants to say, no, that's wrong. And then, of course, at 2 degrees Celsius, it gets kind of tough, right? Extreme warming could occur in major population centers in North America, the Mediterranean, massive chunks of Asia. The report, the IPCC report emphasizes that the closing window of opportunity is also really salient because at some point these processes begin to have kind of a life of their own. And even if we control greenhouse gas emissions and slow the warming process, there's going to be a piece baked in, no pun intended, that will be hard to undo. It is easy enough, if you think about it, to situate the origins of climate risk in industrial capitalism, right? So like on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that most of the global emissions, as I understand it, that the world has ever seen have happened since I was in high school. That's pretty sobering. And yet, of course, the roots of this go back a lot further. In 1820, almost 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty, defined as living on less than $1.90 a day in purchasing power parity. By 2015, the figure that's comparable is 10%. So as a result, we're happier, healthier, live longer today. Far greater percentage can read, write, vote. That's great. But that story is a story of burning fossil fuels heavily. Improvements in human lifespans, quality of life, et cetera, tend to relate pretty closely to measures we have of fossil fuel burning. When economies transition to fossil fuels, energy scarcity no longer limited the value of capital inputs, nor the value of outputs to a society's economy, unleashing a ton of growth. There are different ways to tell the story, but one thing that caught my attention is a Swedish study finding that the Swedish economy increased energy supply, and that was the most important driver of growth in that country between 1800 and 1950, where the rapid increase in the use of electricity, coal, and oil in 1900 produced GDP per capita growth of 2.5, up from 0.7. So different ways to tell the story, but fossil fuel burning helped economic growth and also encouraged a ton of pollution. Negative externalities are familiar to anybody in this room. They're a familiar feature of how our markets work. Markets are structured through equally familiar institutions like courts and all kinds of rules that lead to iterative technological progress, much of it spurred by this combustible cycle of burning stuff and generating energy. Just as familiar are the inequities built into the structure of the international system that contribute to profound and subtle climate risk experienced differently by people in different parts of the world. So as Leah Greenfield and other scholars persuasively argue, it takes the kind of national narrative making individuals feel identified with national groups to build the kind of massive infrastructure of roads, electric power, market institutions, enabling industrial economic growth of the scale we now have. Borders make it easy for some countries to externalize climate risk because the costs of climate change aren't distributed evenly. So by some fairly conservative estimates, it's likely that climate change will push more than 120 million people into poverty by 2030. The countries that have burned the most fossil fuel will tend not to experience the most severe climate risks. And of course, geopolitical competition has given countries a big incentive for economic growth. Okay, far from the headlines but close to activation, nuclear weapons capable of wreaking enormous damage on civilization as we know it are readily deployed and subject to rickety command and control systems in many parts of the world. A reasonable premise is that any serious use of nuclear weapons, frankly any use of nuclear weapons, would have a staggering effect on the world, not only because of the potential loss of life and environmental consequences, but because of the likely impact on global norms. Despite a reduction in nuclear armaments of about 80% since the end of the Cold War, the arsenals of the United States and Russia still include thousands of nuclear weapons. In 2017, there were an estimated 9,220 nuclear weapons in the world. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the possibility of their use seems really quite remote to anybody in this room. But the risks of accidental launch are not unfamiliar from tightly coupled systems and mishaps that we experienced during the Cold War. So let me start by just noting that it's worth taking a step back and recognizing what the command and control structure is, even in a country that keeps very tight control of these weapons, like say the United States, right? No international treaty explicitly stops the US from using its nuclear weapons should the president decide to do so. No federal law requires the president to obtain anybody's approval before using nuclear weapons, maybe understandably given the scenarios that we imagine that might trigger use of nuclear weapons. Nothing prevents the president from unilaterally deciding to do so. The president has the option of consulting with military advisors in the short amount of time that perhaps he or she might have before choosing to use weapons in an emergency. But the president doesn't have to do that. They are obligated, his military advisors, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice to follow the orders of their superior officers, which in this case would include the president. The president is obligated to abide by the law of war in any decision to use nuclear weapons, just as the president would be obliged to follow the laws of war in conventional settings. And, you know, all this risks turning the use of nuclear weapons into a kind of informal adjudication, as we would say in administrative law. Then there's risk of accidents. So in 1980, maintenance workers conducting maintenance on the US's then largest nuclear missile facility accidentally dropped a wrench off of a platform elevated more than 70 feet in the air. The wrench punctured the side of the missile, which allowed highly combustible rocket fuel to spill out onto the side of the missile. The mechanics working on the missile did not immediately tell their superiors what had happened, allowing more and more pressurized fuel to leak before officers on the site knew what the problem was or why alarms were sounding. Eventually, enough fuel leaked out that the missile collapsed, resulting in a massive explosion. The nuclear warhead did not detonate. When the incident came to light, the US government's official position was that there was no way that it could have detonated. If it had, the explosion would have killed millions of people in Arkansas and adjacent states, including Yale Law School graduates, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, who were just 50 miles away at the Arkansas Democratic Convention. And of course, history has continued to give us some reminders that normal accidents happen in this context, as Yale sociologist Chick Perot would say. These are familiar risks, but novel ones are also part of the picture. As stockpile stewardship replaces aging analog infrastructure with complex digital systems, we can warmly welcome the nuclear infrastructure into the evolving arms race of cybersecurity. And then there's the advent of nuclear weapons in countries like Pakistan, where command and control gives enormous power to military officials and perhaps even field commanders. Despite falling total stockpiles, several countries, including Russia and Pakistan, have all begun pursuing the development of new tactical nuclear weapons in efforts to modernize their arsenals. As with climate, it's worth acknowledging that some communities have been especially hard hit by the price that civilization has paid for nuclear weapons. Consider the intersecting effects of climate and nuclear in some of the places that people call home around the world. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear bombs in or right above the Marshall Islands. Now, about 5,000 miles west of my home state, there sits a vast concrete dome that the American government built to hold the worst of the nuclear waste that was produced, including lethal concentrations of plutonium. The LA Times recently also reported that the 3.1 million cubic feet of waste include a special extra bonus, 130 tons of irradiated soil shipped from Nevada to the Marshall Islands. As glaciers melt around the world and sea level rises, waves are lapping at the edges of the dome. A recent study by researchers from Columbia showed radiation in some areas of the atoll where a dome is located as comparable to those found in Fukushima and Chernobyl. A tribunal established by the U.S. and the Marshall Islands to address these issues in 1988 ordered the U.S. to pay $2.3 billion, but the U.S. has paid $4 million so far. It's tempting to situate responsibility for a nuclear balance of terror in the dramas of the mid-20th century, especially World War II and the Cold War. Robert Oppenheimer's platoon of physicists, many of them Jewish, would not have decamped to Los Alamos without Hitler's Germany as a threat. And of course, it's telling that the Army kept the weakness of the German nuclear program secret from the scientists who were doing their work in Los Alamos. From those beginnings, it was the Cold War that then scaled nuclear weapons into what Daniel Ellsberg has called the doomsday machine. To deny how these quirks of history shape the nuances of our nuclear balance and world would ignore the origins of our physical nuclear infrastructure, the importance of the peculiar club of declared nuclear powers, the meaning of pivotal confrontations such as between General MacArthur and Truman about using nuclear weapons in Korea, or Curtis LeMay and Kennedy about the role of nuclear threats in the strategy for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet, as with climate change, it borders on madness to ignore the deeper forces generating and sustaining global nuclear risk. The industrial economy made possible Oak Ridge and the rest of the elaborate infrastructure enabling nuclear weapons. Nationalism and geopolitical resources sustained policies that led to tensions and competition among increasingly technologically advanced countries. Those features of global life have almost certainly contributed to the bounty from the industrial economy, given security concerns and countries' desire for global political advantage. And the ability of states to remain different and compete on multiple dimensions allowed us to experience the growth of experimentation in society and expansion that has contributed to the experience and global scale of knowledge about how to govern sensibly. At the same time, it's perhaps not impossible, but quite difficult to tell a persuasive story where all these features of social life are present and somehow Enrico Fermi's atomic pile at the University of Chicago, demonstrating a chain reaction, doesn't lead to the development of a weapon. My claim is simply that if we want to narrate a story of considerable human progress under roughly existing conditions with no nuclear risk, it's really not easy to show that. Fully evaluating the welfare implications of geopolitics is difficult because it's hard to do the counterfactual. But if anybody wants to treat our current accomplishments in civilization as somehow something that we can easily take a scalpel to and simply take nuclear risk out of the equation, I'd say they have quite a bit of explaining to do. The fertility of the modern industrial economy, the possibilities associated with the international system that we have of geopolitical competition, have left us some byproducts that feel toxic. And it's far from clear that we can take that scalpel and simply do without them. So I want to close by simply sharing a few thoughts about where we go from here. What it is that perhaps might help us overcome some of these difficulties, and what difficult questions are then entangled in those domains. Let me talk first about social movements. Practically oriented analysts of how the world changes know how pivotal social movements have been to long-term evolution of policy and law in civil rights, the treatment of women, public health. It's true enough that such movements can constrain discourse and risk disruption, but of course there's a profound upside to their potential impact as well. We need to consider how social movements, combining principled aspirations and personal interests, have motivated large-scale change in the past, and what we can learn from that with respect to climate, nuclear weapons, or any other risk that the world faces. The potential for social movements to affect the history of nuclear armaments and climate change raises nuanced questions about timing and geography. The possibilities are nonetheless plain from Charles Tilly's eloquent description of three elements such movements tend to reflect: a sustained, organized public effort making collective claims on target authorities, let us call it a campaign; employment of combinations, including creations of special purpose associations and coalitions, public meetings, solemn processionals; vigils, rallies, demonstrations, petition drives, and statements to and from the public media; and participants' concerted public display of what he calls WUNC, worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. Of course, we can aspire for policy entrepreneurs, teachers, philanthropists, and activists to take data seriously, to weigh consequences, to spell out alternative scenarios, and channel expert wisdom. More on this in the next lecture. But it's fantasy to think that centrist technocrats drive most meaningful social and policy change. At least in a pluralist society, and arguably in many other societies, a more accurate story would tend to place a meaningful set of responsibilities and causal explanations for social change in the reciprocal effects that arise between key constituencies in the general public responding to shared concerns, leaders of social movements, lawyers, policymakers, technical experts responding to the pressures that they feel. That's almost certainly even more true with respect to climate and nuclear. For the former, the public's actions are profoundly implicated and the cost of transition substantial despite the increasingly favorable economics of cleaner energy. Channeling passion and generating a sense of possibility to overcome futility on this front is like salt is to a New Haven pizza. For the latter, the risk generally is far away from the newspaper front pages we rarely print anymore. An engaged public has the potential to change the political calculus like few other factors can. Changing the stories just now being written without some considerably greater, more galvanized degree of public concern seems ever more remote a possibility. Now let's talk about paradigms. Not only social movements, but also elites are to a considerable extent shaped by the cross-cutting paradigms about geopolitics or economics or law's role in the world that help people make sense of how the world works. To reflect sensibly on whether we can disentangle the blessings of modern civilization from these risks, we need to apply not only our growing knowledge of the risks themselves, but what we know about politics, economics, institutions, and society. We especially need to apply that knowledge to help us learn from how difficult it is for people to imagine the manifestation of risks or to understand how much social welfare is interdependent in an existing framework of economics and politics that might make it difficult for the world to imagine a different setting. GDP, for instance, is only a little less crude as a measure of social well-being than to measure victories in Harvard-Yale football games is as a measure of Yale's well-being. I'm overstating this slightly, but I see both room and urgency for connecting policymaking more thoroughly with perceptive, nuanced measures of well-being that can leverage discussions about genuine progress. It's telling that according to Lutz and Cabede, for example, improved education is a better predictor of increased life expectancy than per capita GDP. New thinking about political economy will not only help ease the challenges associated with climate change, but will likely contribute to our conception of global institutions that may eventually also help us manage nuclear risk. Each paradigm has its characteristic institutional advances. If more decisive progress on climate change or nuclear security will require advances in global institutions, we might ask, how might that advance bring along with it a broader purchase on translating post-neoliberal ideas, if you want to call them that, into improved governance? This is not going to be a linear process. With shifts in institutions and shifts in the functioning of markets, building the lived experience that paves the way for a broader institutional and intellectual change. So tonight, I've sought to acknowledge the enormous social progress that makes our ambitious legal system, the global internet, and even this conversation possible. But I've also tried to emphasize an awkward, uncomfortable reality that any candid evaluation of modern human life must face up to. We have longer lives and more material wealth in part because we've burned fuels that pollute and now imperil the earth, and we've organized societies into countries that compete, sometimes go to war, and in some cases have the capacity to threaten nuclear annihilation. Picture is not entirely or purely bleak. Regarding climate, for example, the economics of renewables and efficiency are extremely attractive. Recent studies indicate that renewables are the cheapest new electricity across most of the world. Energy efficiency is a great investment almost everywhere. On the nuclear front, one House of Congress recently voted to defund the push for tactical nuclear weapons. Yet climate and nuclear are more urgent than people realize, and also much more entangled in the deep structure of society. The continuous observation and attention to nuance that I called for when I addressed students at commencement was meant to remind us of the mysteries around us that stubbornly elude our grasp. If that realization makes us feel a bit less confident about how exactly we navigate the dilemmas embodied by Oak Ridge, perhaps it will also help us keep a sense of wonder about the small miracles brimming with secrets, about the fragile world we'll soon entrust to the next generation having chicken souvlaki and garlic bread at Clark's Dairy. Thank you. I want you to know I almost never come up to give a talk with more than 5 pages, so this is unusual, and I'm really grateful that you sat through it. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. Let's start over here. And tell me your background a little bit.
Yeah, I'm an undergraduate. I'm a junior, majoring in EP&E.
Terrific.
I was really interested by sort of your last, or one of your last points about the importance of social movements as sort of a mover of policy, of society. And also, and how that sort of relates to your background working in the judicial branch, which I sometimes, and maybe this is a misperception on my part, but I sort of see it as more isolated from social movements and see sort of the legislative and executive branches as more influenced or more of targets by social movements. And can you sort of speak to that?
I can try. That's perceptive. And I would say in some ways, it's both important to recognize that in our system, the way we narrate how our system is supposed to work, we look to the judiciary to be apart a little bit more from society and to be a sort of guardian and to be neutral. And I don't disagree that that's an important part of our tradition and the way we work. That said, it's also important to recognize that even the courts are buffeted about by the tensions and the passions and the concerns that people will sometimes mobilize around. Now, part of what a court needs to do is to engage with that in the appropriate way and at the appropriate time. But I notice the interplay of social mobilization and litigation and public understanding of issues around civil rights that played out in our history in the middle of the 20th century. And let me give you an example that's a little bit kind of different, like kind of out there. Like you might think of it as very different, but I view it also as an example of how social mobilization and the tensions that affect the public intersect with a large judiciary. So Professor Rosenblatt and I were just talking as we came in about the scale of California's court system. And it's actually truly staggering even to me after 5 years of this. So California has 40 million people and we have about 6.5 million cases, maybe a year. We have 2,500 judges. And that means that actually having that system run day to day in an administrative way to meet the needs of Californians who might need to go to court to get a restraining order or to deal with an elder abuse issue and have no lawyer, or in some cases don't speak the language. It's a really important responsibility we have. And in that way, courts, I would argue, should be responsive to the concerns raised by socially mobilized people who say, hey, your legal system says that I should have my day in court, never mind that I can't speak the language so well or I'm poor. And the courts cannot redress every problem in society, but then being aware of the fact that 210 languages are spoken in California, that maybe about 7.5 million Californians don't speak English very well, that interpreters are needed in not only criminal but civil proceedings, that feels to me like one of several examples of where the courts also have a responsibility to engage with the public. Yeah.
I'm Dean Connolly. I graduated from Yale. You can't imagine an age like that in 1953. I was a commercial banker. I had 6 children, 14 grandchildren, and I moved here 4 years ago after my wife died. The state of Georgia probably has a temperature that's more than 2 degrees hotter than Connecticut. It's probably 6 degrees hotter. So why isn't that an apt comparison to say that we could adapt, aside from the fact that water flows everywhere? And you're not a scientist, I know, but you're an awfully clear thinker.
Well, I appreciate that. I wish I were an even clearer thinker. But having grown up in a climate very similar to Georgia's for at least part of my life, I know in some ways exactly what you mean. So before I moved to California, I lived in the part of northern Mexico that's right on the border with South Texas. And the weather in Georgia and in northern Mexico is very familiar to me and very similar. It's extremely humid. It's very, very hot in the summer. And the combination of, 96 degree, 98 degree weather on a hot day with 90-something% humidity is, to me, a lot worse than 117 degrees in the desert, but with a lot of dryness, which I also experience. So it's a fair question for that reason, and I gather from my colleagues who are scientists that the real issue has to do with the fact that these degree warming figures are really global averages that are masking enormous variation around the world, right? So it's less an issue of does the temperature on average just nudge upwards everywhere the same way, just 1 or 2 degrees hotter. It's more like tweak the temperature a little bit and big changes might happen in risk of wildfire or in the likelihood of additional precipitation or in the impact on a glacier that then, as it melts, releases a certain combination of chemicals that then speeds up the further release of additional gases that then create further greenhouse gas sort of global warming type effects. So it's a very crude measure of something that actually is more subtle. The more subtle point is what are the forces that are driving global climate? And I will say, not being a scientist, I try my best to sort of look into this with prudence as somebody who's mostly trying to survey like what is a scientific consensus. But I'll just give you one example of how this is becoming an interesting and difficult question for the courts and why I started trying to get more deep into trying to understand these forces. So California decided through a democratic process to set targets on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a continuing challenge in taking that set of targets that play out over 20, 25 years and matching it up to the environmental review process that California requires for land use decisions. So if you want to build 5,000 homes in Santa Clarita, California, then the environmental review you have to do has to address a set of environmental questions that might be relevant to whether the state can meet its environmental commitments. So how do you take these greenhouse gas emissions goals that the state has set and somehow adjudicate like who's responsible for what proportion of that in building projects? I must say, I find that a really humbling and difficult challenge. But it's an example of why it is that scientists and judges need to work together to understand each other's worlds in a way.
Thank you, so, for responding thoughtfully. I never thought of it before being here today.
Well, I'm still learning. Thank you. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you so much for coming. I was just talking to Professor Rosenbluth about how ridiculously cool it is that we get like 3 days to just spend with you. So thank you.
That means a lot to me.
My name's Akhil. I'm an undergrad here, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about your background is that you have both a JD and a PhD in political science. So I was wondering how that kind of political science background informs the way you approach both the courts and also the role of law in society from an academic perspective.
Yeah, so I was partly also talking to Professor Rosenbluth when I came in about the differences in the educational experience I had in law school versus PhD. So I'll start with that. I thought when I was an undergrad that, crazy though it seemed to try to get both degrees, one reason to do it would be that law school would be really practical. I'd learn a set of skills about trial practice. I'd learn how to take a deposition. I'd learn how to plan an oral argument. I'd learn how to decipher a statute. And then PhD would be a chance to sort of have those discussions that I love to have as an undergrad about how does the world work? Who's responsible for what? What's moral and ethical? Like, how do you measure changes in political behavior? And I found that it did not actually work out that way entirely. Partly Yale Law School in particular is a little quirky, right? So there's a lot of discussing and academic thinking going on. There was also a terrific clinic, which is where I learned to be kind of a lawyer. And Professor Wisner was sort of at the core of that. He was one of the faculty members in the trial practice program and just kind of helped all of us who were in the clinic try to draw some connection between the more theoretical stuff we were learning in the classroom and like, what do you do when you have to deliver bad news to a client and they don't want to hear it and you don't want to say it, but you have to be honest with them. Over time, I found that there's one way in which both law school and PhD really converged, and then there's another way in which they're very different. Where they converged is I'm interested in structure. I'm interested not only in what it is that people think is a good idea, but I'm interested in the forces around them that allow that idea to be expressed and acted on and to thrive versus to crash and burn in a way. And those forces can range from kind of economics to politics and political pressure, law enforcement, like any number of things, peer groups, etc. And in that respect, I feel like both law school and the PhD program in their own ways were concerned with that. I had a phenomenal teacher in law school who was a visiting professor when I was here, and sadly he's passed away now, William Stuntz. What I loved about him is he actually like brought together perfectly the PhD in political science side, although he wasn't a political scientist, he thought like one, and the doctrinal lawyer, because he would be talking about what it is a court required from courts when they were overseeing the way police might have interrogated a suspect. And then he'd step out of that and say, what are the pressures for a police department in that situation? What are cops actually going to do? How are they going to understand those instructions? So that's the way in which they come together. The way in which they diverge is that the PhD in political science was mostly not normative. It was mostly about what forces are affecting political behavior in the world. Law has a normative component. What is the right way to read a statute? What's the wrong way to interpret a constitution? What would be wrong for a court to do that maybe a legislature should do? So as judge, I draw on that training a lot and recognize that political science might inform my understanding of how a court decision might be perceived or what pressures a court might be under. But I have to create a space where I can turn that off. And I can think more profoundly about being like a fiduciary in a way and trying to protect and honor a set of traditions we have to make sure that they don't get cast aside. I'm glad people are raising their hands because as a law professor, of course, I can call on people too.
Well, thank you for being here. Kind of echo Akhil's logic there that I'm really excited about this whole lecture series. My name's Grace. I'm also a junior in the EP&E major. I guess my question mainly draws from this kind of like bottom-up movements that we're seeing very recently, particularly like as we're addressing climate. We saw on campus and kind of around the world a lot of what seemed like protests-based discussion on climate, but it still feels like to me both climate and nuclear are very top-driven decisions, and that movements from the bottom don't seem to move the needle in any way. So I was wondering what your perspective on that was, or how to make more of a difference without feeling like it's somewhat futile.
I think it's a phenomenal question, and it's a challenging one. Let me start by gently suggesting an amendment to one aspect of your premise. I'm about to share like what I'm most confident about in answering your question, and then beyond that, my level of confidence drops a bit. Climate is very bottom up. Like you could say, part of my message is that there's no question that there's a policy component to how the world has come to be in this situation. But I think even more important than the policy decision making has been a set of social processes, some of them around the logic of economic growth, some of them around consumer behavior, some of them around how we allocate responsibility to each other or not, such that it's kind of a collective action problem. And we all have had our various reasons to do things, not because we don't care about the climate, but because we begin to wonder, well, how does my change in my behavior really affect the whole picture? And then do I have an incentive to stop doing what I'm doing? Or am I really even fully aware? I mean, it's a version of the problem I was describing earlier of allocating an emissions reduction target to a set of much narrower circumstances. And that institutional problem, to me, is at the heart of the climate situation. One of the corollaries of it now is the very real challenge of contending with billions of people who have yet to fully enjoy the gains of having achieved what we would call middle class status in an advanced industrialized country, who are like, yeah, I don't want the planet to, be in crisis for climate reasons, but I also don't want to have a constraint on my people's ability to prosper in the way that people already before me have when they were able to burn a whole bunch of stuff. And the nuanced policy questions around that, I think, need to be informed by a bottom-up process of engaging with people whose trust we will need if that is going to be carried off. Because otherwise, like California, we like to say to people, it's the 5th largest economy in the world if you measure it a certain way, and yes, it is, but what we do is going to be meaningless in comparison to the decisions that are made in places like China and India, right? Now, I think that the other part of your question, which remains challenging to me, is nuclear does feel to me more like driven top-down, although not without a component of responses to popular ferment, like Afghanistan, not Afghanistan, Pakistan might be an example of that dynamic to some extent, India. But then what do we do about it? And I guess my step one would be we care about it, right? Like I think it seems like a cop-out to say that, but I don't think I'm mostly not talking about nuclear. Like it doesn't show up in my docket so much, but it shows up in my conversations with my kids and makes me wonder about how it is that our popular discourse is really giving us a full picture of what it is that we need. And I think the next step is, particularly if we're lucky enough to be in settings where we're protected enough to have room to think deep thoughts and to work with other smart people, to sort of sketch it out. Like, what are you going to do about it when you're a policymaker someday and you actually find yourself surprised one day to realize that your jurisdiction is not purely about this, but it actually begins to get you closer to this. Maybe you're the US ambassador to NATO, or maybe you work at a big foundation and you're deciding what international security problem to deal with. And there I think we need all the help we can get. And it's telling to me that even the George Shultzes and Sam Nunns of the world have sketched out a vision that is compelling for many, but it's not obvious how we get from here to there. Yeah, over here.
Hi, I'm Italian and I majored in economics.
Great.
So I really thank you for your presence and me too, same wavelength. Then I'm really excited about all these conferences and talk which will take place these days. And I would want to start about doing an ewology of Connecticut. We joined the recent lawsuit after California, which was started by the state of New York about greenhouse emissions. And so in the federal lawsuit challenging the withdrawal of a waiver that allowed California to set its own greenhouse gas regulations. So some experts say that the legal basis for revoking this waiver may be shaky, and I would want to know your opinion about that.
So I can't talk really about litigation because some of these things might in some form end up before my court, but I can tell you a couple things that feel to me important. One of the burdens of anybody who is calling for social movements to play an appropriate role in social change is to then recognize that there is a tension between the highly technical and protected decision making that tends to have to happen in courts or adjudicating cases like that, and the fervor and intensity and anger that people have about any set of actions. So I think that's difficult, and I feel like it's important for courts to be able to say sometimes like, well, you know, it's not our job to ultimately decide the merits of the policy itself. It's our job to figure out what the parameters really fairly are. But I will also say something else without getting into the merits of litigation, and that is, it feels to me like an important achievement of our legal system is to have built a mechanism for reason giving for a lot of important decisions that are made by executive decision makers to be subjected to a kind of dialogue where we ask, what are your reasons? And that is an important part of a process to disentangle where is there crass partisanship or where is there no motive at all other than just sort of anger or frustration or a desire to appease a certain part of the public, and where there's actually some degree of thinking. And that thinking could include a sort of civic judgment about what it is that the country needs. It's not all technical. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But it does feel to me that that interplay puts judges sometimes in a very tricky place, but one that needs to be carefully protected. Yes?
Awareness of climate change seems twice as high this year as it was a year ago. Is that anywhere near fast enough, or should you, who are so articulate, take leadership in the United States of America to create more urgency? Or should little people like
I've got a job that I like very much, but I think ultimately I can, there's some things I can say about this as a kind of scholar, and some things that have to sort of remain for my day job. But I do feel like you raise a good question again about this interplay of social movements, and then like the second point I made is largely about paradigms of thought, right? Which is a different kind of work and a different kind of leadership. And like, where does leadership come from? And I must say, like, I think a lot in terms of coalition building. So let me give you one experience that I had working in the Obama administration on criminal justice issues. Somewhat different than what we're talking about now. Certainly a role very different from the role that I have as a judge, but there is a bit of an overlap in that you have to listen to different voices. And the issue specifically there was about drug sentences. So it's probably familiar to a lot of you that when punishments are doled out for drug crimes, historically there had been a time in our history where crack cocaine offenses were punished very, very, very differently from powder cocaine offenses. There's still in some jurisdictions a disparity in how we punish these. But for a while in the federal system, the disparity, if you look at quantities that were necessary to trigger particular penalties, were disparities of like 100 to 1. And so when the president that I worked for was running for office, he did mention this issue as one issue on which he wanted to try to work for change. When he became president, it became clear to any number of us working with the president that the bandwidth that we had to do anything near all the promises that he had made was not there. You had to like a lot of the jobs seemed to be early on picking which issues were possible to work on given the window of possibilities that existed at the time. And so working with some colleagues at the Department of Justice, we had some work to do in persuading our colleagues in the administration that this was an issue that the administration had the bandwidth to move forward on. So that took some discussion of ideas, like the theory of change, as it were, that we floated was that this mattered not only because of the people who might be affected in the federal system, but also in the states, right? The vast majority of criminal prosecutions happen in the states. And some change in policy responsibly done with bipartisan support at the federal level could be the kind of signal that might encourage some states to take another look at these things. And so the impact could be multiplied. That level of buy-in led to then a strategy of trying to move this forward, but in a way that was as bipartisan as possible, which admittedly was easier done then than now. But there was a crucial few weeks, months, where the folks who were working on this in Congress, as well as those of us in the administration, had meetings with advocacy groups. And we had to basically try to help them see that some of the ways in which this could best move forward would be to actually lower the temperature of the issue. It wouldn't be to bring as much attention to it. It would be to actually recognize that already a lot of attention had been moved to it, and now it was about building a coalition that would bring others together from the other party. And there was some disagreement about that, but ultimately some understanding that that was necessary. And that probably helped get this enacted with a bipartisan vote, on a voice vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee, get it through the Senate quickly, get it to the House quickly before floor time ran out. So I draw two lessons from that. Oh, by the way, also another crucial piece of that was evangelical Christian leadership was in many ways quite supportive of this, as were libertarian conservatives. So the coalition building was difficult, but it was crucial. So one lesson that I draw from this is that there is no solving this problem without pulling along people who disagree about a lot of things. And that takes a lot of listening and a lot of hard work and a lot of careful trust building first. The second lesson to me is that this is partly about ideas. It's partly about forging a common language that gets people to understand to what extent their own interests are really impacted by this. You know, I don't think that's a perfect answer, but at least it highlights some of what I think is part of the answer.
That's really good. I have an Irish impatience, and that doesn't lend itself to trying to seduce rather than impose. And that's tough.
It is, like, you know, for all of us who think of the separation of powers as being pretty important in American life, Congress does one thing, the executive branch does another. I will say ruefully that when you're in the executive branch, sometimes you feel like it's so frustrating how much process there is to get certain things done. And you look hard at what you can legally do using executive authority, legally. But sometimes I think the history of Congress is revealing, because it's not just about what can you get done with executive authority, even if it's legal to do that. It's also about how can you build a coalition of support that is likely to protect what you've done in a way that is going to transcend 1 or 2 or 3 or 7 administrations.
Is that any fun, or is it so hard?
Oh, it's tons of fun. I recommend it.
Thank you.
Yes, down here.
I actually should find out if there are any students who have any questions before I ask one. Riley, do you want to ask one?
Yeah, I will.
All right.
I actually had a little bit of a burning question. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm Bradley. I major in ethics, politics, and economics, and also in computer science.
Great.
You were talking a little bit about the possibility of advancing global institutions in creating structures that might address these larger problems that assail all of us as sort of humanity, and not just America as a nation. And that's very heartening to me, because I'm not from America. I'm from Singapore. I'm studying at Yale. But I find American institutions and American history and, of course, the American political order extremely important and significant for your allies and your friends abroad. My concern, in particular with climate change, is that we're currently operating in a sort of super political model whereby sustainable growth is still sort of possible if we limit our CO2 emissions such that the rising temperature remains below 1.5 to 2 degrees. As that window closes, the game starts to change, and we begin to get into a sort of a zero-sum winners and losers game if we go beyond 2 degrees. And I was wondering, how would global institutions, or how would more developed countries, of which I come from, a country that has definitely benefited a lot from the global industrial revolution and has an incredibly high GDP per capita, so this is on my head as well. How do we bear responsibility or think about what we owe others in a situation where sustainable growth is no longer a possibility, where it is really kind of like a dog-eat-dog world, and there are going to be sort of millions of people who are displaced and who don't have a possibility for further development simply because the situation has just gone too bad.
My first choice is that we all do our part and we don't get to that point, but I think you know, many people in your generation or even younger could ask the question with even more of an edge. You've asked it very diplomatically, and I welcome that and appreciate that, because I think diplomacy is important as well as urgency. But here's the restated version that is more urgent in a way. You could say, my generation comes along and I'm experiencing like this great massive fork in the road, and one path leads to a place where people who are part of my generation are not going to get to live the kind of life that we might have otherwise been able to, for reasons that are not of our own making primarily. So what do you do about that? Your generation, meaning mine to some extent, and what do all of us do about it? Because if we don't, you know, you're not fully the one that's going to pay the full price. And I'm not saying that's all that you're saying, but I think there's an element of your question that has that in it, and rightly so. Like I'm still struggling with just coming to terms with what it means to have like most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the history of humanity having come, as I understand it, since I was in high school, right? But let me sort of say a word or two about what happens before a tipping point and how to think about after a tipping point. So before a tipping point, there's an interplay of self-interested action and moral and ethical reasoning. And much of what you do in ethics, politics, and economics is to think about how and why and when those are blended together and when they're actually in tension with each other and what to do about that. I hope that by evoking social movements, I'm both suggesting the need for more compelling storytelling and believable narratives about interest, about who is paying what price and why it's in our interest, like up to and including the economic possibilities around renewables, but also including like prices that we will pay in a time horizon that is not so remote. But I also mean to evoke the idea that some moral and ethical reasoning is important. I had hoped to believe that when I'm trying my best to make sense of what is happening in my own state, I'm looking at legislative history that shows not only California's concern for its own wildfires, but concern for people who are thousands of miles away, however imperfectly executed. But I think it is not a lie that you see that, and that feels to me like it's something we can build up, right? Like there are going to be times when the better narrative is to say, no, don't think about it in moral terms, just be honest. Like the returns to clean energy are extraordinary. Like you just have to see it in a clear way and maybe not be subsidizing X, Y, or Z so much. And there are times when we all have to limit some of what we'd otherwise love to do. After the tipping point, I mean, you know, query what tipping point you pick, but because there are several, right? But tipping points evoke to me, in my most optimistic moments, massive public health emergencies of a disastrous scale. And I will say that the world can and has mobilized around those. That the World Health Organization is not a perfect organization, but countries cooperate and they have a lot vested in stopping something that is going to affect them all and is going to make them vulnerable in ways that they do not want. And so it makes me feel like I don't take for granted the fragility or the impossibility of building some shared cooperation, even in a system of sovereign nations that we have and that we celebrate, right? So it feels to me like laying the groundwork for that so that if and when that shift happens, we can take advantage of that infrastructure in a compelling way is also worth a lot of kind of devil in the details sort of work. What organizations, what career tracks, who goes to work where, you know, what's the legal superstructure to do that, what countries are going to be part of what coalitions, how to share the cost, and so on.
Thank you.
Great. And by the way, somebody said ridiculously cool. I feel this is ridiculously cool too. Like, it is just marvelous for me to have the chance to have this conversation, and you're having an impact on me. Yeah?
I'm Jeremy. I'm also a junior in
Sure.
You mentioned that climate change will push 120 million people into poverty by 2030. And I'm curious exactly how that would happen.
That is a very good question. Here I will say, before I was on the court, I was the head of an institution in Stanford called the Freeman Spogli Institute, which was an institute for international studies, comparable probably to what you have at Yale. And that institution, to my great delight, had a center called the Center on Food Security and the Environment, which we ran jointly with Stanford's Interdisciplinary Institute on the Environment. And it was one of my favorite places in the Institute because it was like the perfect meeting ground of policy and hardcore science. And I hired some of the people that do this sort of work. So I can tell you some of the methods that they use, but there are people who are more expert than I am that can tell you more details. So some of what you do is you use simulations. You aggregate data about how climate effects have had economic impacts on people around access to food, around changes in economic livelihoods, around economic, social and political and violent conflict, to some extent around migration patterns. And you begin to see how those secondary effects have an effect on who's above and below the poverty line. So then you make estimates with some band of confidence, and you adjust those over time as additional data come in. The ability we have to use new methods to pinpoint this with somewhat greater confidence has really increased in the last 3 to 4 years. So one technique is satellite images, which we can then match up with fairly precise pictures of weather and climate. So we're beginning to develop a sort of global body of knowledge around how the effect happens. But I think the main takeaway intellectually relative to your question is it's not one effect, one sort of like causal pathway. It's partly food, partly economics, partly conflict, partly even we're beginning to see the cognitive impact of heat on people's ability to do productive work. So there's a kind of frontier we're pushing outward, and it's kind of encouraging to me how much we're learning, but it's not encouraging what we're learning. Yeah, over here.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm
Sure.
Johnny. I'm a senior in the EP&E major, and I was just thinking, you seem very optimistic about social movements, and you bring up abstract models, and at least from me and the people around me, it seems that a lot of people are aware about climate change as an issue, but realistically, they don't really do much, and maybe it's a matter of them not caring enough, maybe it's a matter of them not knowing enough, but I was just wondering why you seem to have so much faith in these social movements, especially since they've been around for a while and haven't had a lot of progress, at least from what I see. Maybe you think differently, and why you think it's enough.
Thank you. And I should say, it's kind of ironic you say what you do about how much optimism I have, because I think of myself as leaning in the optimistic direction often. And as I was writing this, I thought, this sounds so depressing. It's so not like me. And it did feel like a weird sort of coda to things I've said at times that emphasize a little bit more let's remember the context. We're all heirs of this extraordinary progress in civilization. Let's not waste it. So I don't mean to sound overly optimistic. I think this is a not solved problem, and we're sharing it. I want to at least acknowledge that I feel it. I think mostly in my day job, it gets channeled into particular cases and applying particular bodies of law that are democratically enacted. But as a scholar, I feel like I have a need to be aware of it and a need to think about how the disciplines in which I work, institutional history and development, political science, public law, cyber law, how all those fields are grappling with this, because I think of it as cutting across everything we do. And yet, I will actually gently argue with a little bit of the premise of your question in the following way. So I think let me start with political economy paradigms, and then I'll move to social movements. I would really challenge anyone to tell me that political economy paradigms, like how we think about supply and demand or how we think about market failure, have had no effect on policymaking. I would in fact argue that they've had enormous effect, in part because they hum and work in the background a little bit. You don't even see them entirely. And of course, none of these paradigms are entirely wrong about everything. It's partly their logic that sustains them, but of course then the logic gets broadened, perhaps beyond what it should. So the work of engineering paradigms that take seriously the complexity of the social world and what we do with that knowledge is hard work. But it's like Yale work, and it's ethics, politics, and economics work, right? It's your work as well as mine. Social movements, I think, have had also a very big impact. They just haven't exactly had the full impact some might desire in these particular areas. But I'll mention 3 places where I would argue they've had a substantial impact: the treatment of women, public health, and civil rights. So the civil rights story is the most familiar, and in some ways you could say I'm trying to make a plea that in addition to scientists, we think of these problems as suitable to MLK, to rhetoric, to mobilization, to a sense that there's an inspiration around these issues. And that's why, in a way, some of what it takes is to sound scary, but also optimistic enough to mobilize people to make them feel like they can make a difference. But that's work for others to do, not for judges to do. On public health, I would say many of the public health issues I've worked on in my career, like food safety, tobacco, I can't imagine the scientists getting to do their work and the lawyers getting to enact legislation without the concern of moms across parties who are freaked out about how this particular thing that their kids ate is going to make their kids have a long-term disability, like forever. There's nothing like a room full of moms or dads, parents, who are freaked out about that. And it's moving in a way, but it tells you a story of why it is that when the president signed the Food Modernization Act, and we worked on it, a team of people on it, you could look out at the Rose Garden and see Republican and Democratic senators from red and green and purple and blue states, all co-sponsoring that and being there for the ceremony. So I'm sounding optimistic again. And I don't mean to sound overly optimistic, but I feel like there is a reason to feel like there's still a logic that we can leverage to end up in a better place. You had a question.
Well, I just want to make sure the students all have a chance. I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, please.
Sure. Hi, Justice.
Hi.
My question is about democracy and climate change. And it begins by asking, do you think climate change is a state of emergency or a crisis that's worthy of being called an emergency? And why I ask that is because in my classes I'm reading Friedrich Hayek, an advocate for limited government.
Sure.
But he argues that in times of emergency, you need to have avenues to suspend democratic or limited government. And the problem I see today is a myopia of people in relation to climate change, where the short-term interest, as you said before, to proliferate or fertility of economics is to neglect it. But the long-term interest, obviously, is to solve it. But because of the way democracy is structured, and we have this myopia, it doesn't seem we're getting the direct intervention we need. And I'm from China, so I see in China a country that's really leading the fight right now. It's a non-democratic process that's creating a lot of the results. And earlier, I think it's really interesting you mentioned that in the US, there's no federal law which requires a president to use nuclear weapons with approval. Do you think that if climate change is a state of emergency, wouldn't it make sense for a similar statute or regulation to apply to executive powers on facing climate change?
So, being from California, it's hard for me not to think of the mix of circumstances and effects associated with climate change as being anything other than an emergency. And so that doesn't change necessarily the way I think about the cases when they come to me. It's a question of applying the law and trying to do right by what has been enacted there. But as a scholar, I would say it's hard for me to think that the world should treat this as anything other than an emergency. But of course, that then raises the next part of your question, which is what should we expect from a responsible, thoughtful, ethical government in an emergency? And I would actually distinguish between 3 different modes of action. There are many others, but just 3 to illustrate some distinctions. One would be a very participatory democracy approach, which would argue that the public is a constraint for a reason, that we get as close as possible to the public itself being brought along to see something as an emergency, and that particularly if you don't have to make a snap judgment, the responsibility you have is to actually bring the public along. And so one example that I could give from American history where that approach was largely followed, not entirely. Well, maybe not quite, but let me illustrate it this way. At various points, presidents might have said, I need to do this, but I'd best do it with the support of the general public. So there were aspects of how Franklin Roosevelt handled the lead up to World War II that have elements of this. Not purely, but have elements of, I need to get the public to understand why this is important, why it's in their interest that we do this. At the other extreme, I would suggest a position that is about the emergency being so compelling that it's not worth delaying to engage the public. And I guess, here there's some room for discussion about how the world works and should work, but my own view is probably shaped by my experience as an American, which is to be distrustful of any severing of that link. And I would say the courts are a good example where that link is sort of maintained in between. We do things that are counter-majoritarian in the court. The legislature wants to do something, and sometimes we say no. That is our job, sometimes, to protect people by enforcing the Constitution. But that's something that requires caution and care, right? And I would note that for better and not better, in our country, our courts have an electoral check sometimes. And that works in different ways, but at least in California, there are retention elections every 12 years. So that brings me to the intermediate position, which is perhaps the one that I would favor the most. And that is a leader saying, I'm a leader. I'm not just a walking, talking referendum for public opinion. I'm supposed to lead. I'm supposed to illustrate where I believe society should come. And then I'm supposed to try to bring you along and persuade you. But as Amartya Sen would say, I have the constraint of persuading you, because without that, you rightly will fear me, and you should, because there may not be a limit to what I'm going to do to you. And I think that's a tension, because I don't think that always works. So I'm looking for further dialogue and deliberation, but at least where I'm coming from, it's very important to maintain that link to how are you going to persuade the public.
I think that's a great note on which to end for tonight. Feast enough, and we will feast tomorrow again. So thank you so much.
Thank you.